Morning once again. It's very good to see all of you. I'm glad that you're here in attendance with us to continue with our Bible study time as we're moving through the book of John, John 11, and we're going to pick up in verse 49. I forgot to tell that to him with the lower third, the class and everything, where we're picking up.
I just wrote John 11 and then
Yeah.
the two dots, and I'll wait
I
for
forgot
you to
put 40.
46, so you want 49?
Yeah.
There you go.
Um,
69 upside down.
Yeah, exactly. We left off in discussing the miracle that's already taken place with raising Lazarus from the dead, the result that the performing of that miracle brought on the audience. You have some that believed, but you have some that went their ways to the Pharisees, told them what things Jesus had done. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees, a council, it's a secret meeting of the Sanhedrin. All the top players are going to be involved in this, and they are coming together trying to figure out, all right, what are we going to do about this? And the reason why they're having to have this meeting, for this man doth many miracles. Okay, we have them admitting in secret what they should be admitting in public. But then we also have the motivation and the reason why they're not coming out and admitting these things for everybody to hear. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. Well, if you are a good and proper Jew like you're supposed to be, then this is what all of your prophecies are pointing towards. Everybody's supposed to be coming over and following him, just as Moses said. God is going to raise up a prophet like unto me. You listen to him, and you do all that he says. And we've been studying about the problem that they've been having is, okay, everything that's been prophesied under the Old Testament system has been through apocalyptic language that's signified, symbolized, codified, types and shadows. It's not just being spelled out to these prophets. So they're having to watch these things unfold in real time. But as they're watching them unfold in real time, then they should be recognizing, okay, this is the one we're needing to put our faith in. They're not willing to do that, and here's the reason why. Well, they'll believe him, they won't listen to us. And the Romans shall come and take away both our place and our nation. This also gives us insight as to what is happening inside of Israel and the system that God had given to them and how it's being manipulated by outside forces. These individuals are pointing to the fact of who it was that put them in their places. So we're fixing to look at Caiaphas here in a moment, who was high priest. Well, how is it that the high priest, the office of the high priest, how is it established who's supposed to go into that position?
Wasn't it supposed to be?
Can't hear you.
Wasn't it supposed to be from the Levite tribe, and the priests were supposed to rotate as far as?
Okay, so it comes from the tribe of Levi, but then it gets even more specific. Who from inside the tribe of Levi?
Eleazar's family.
Well, so that's going back to John 1 and discussing of John the Baptist and his family, which you're right, but you need to track it back a little bit further. Aaron. Aaron's sons are the ones that uphold the office of priesthood and that of high priest. But during this time frame, and Josephus and other secondary historical writers give us record on how it is that Rome and Herod had come in and they had put people into position that they wanted. And even the Bible has given us insight on that too. Here they are admitting, well, the only reason we're in the place that we're in is because Rome put us here. And if we leave Jesus alone, and he has these people go off and follow him, and he's causing a ruckus and causing an uproar, well, then Rome will come in and take us out and put somebody else into position. Yes, sir?
So what are they they want the Messiah to take over Rome,
Yep.
or what do they want?
There's inconsistency all the way around. All right, we want a Messiah that's going to overthrow Rome, but we don't like this guy, and we don't want Rome to come in and take us out. Yes, ma'am.
Well, can we also kind of play to the fact that with those sorts of thoughts of Rome coming in and taking them out and having their David, their physical David, who's the warrior, blah, 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 coming to save them from Rome, they totally throw aside the purity of their religion, because if they really cared about religion, they wouldn't care that the Romans say, hey, we want Caiaphas to be in charge. They would say, no, we have to listen to what God had to
Right.
say.
Right.
So,
This isn't something I have in my notes, so it's something I'm formulating in the moment.
Is this how it works?
Can we not see with what was just laid out in that situation about, okay, if we are going to be concerned about religion in its purest form and purest fashion, and that is that God is the one that dictates how religion is supposed to go. And then we see in this the corruption that comes in once outside government wants to start overstepping its bounds. And then the responsibility that we would have as God-fearing people, as Jamie pointed out, they would have the responsibility, we would have the responsibility to withstanding government and saying, no, we are not letting you do this, we are not allowing this, and you can do what you want. And to a large degree, that is what Jesus is doing throughout all of his earthly ministry. Not so much in opposition to Rome, because they're not really the problem. The problem is the Jews. In that you know better, you claim to be following God, and yet you're allowing all these different things to come in and step in to guide how you're going to make your decisions based upon, well, what's this other section of society going to do? And that, yeah, they shouldn't have been going along with this. Everything going on with Herod that they have taking place, did Herod do some good things for the Jews? Yeah. But do those good things outweigh and overpower the bad things he was doing? Herod was a maniac. I mean, Herod is the one that had John the Baptist put to death. And yet we live in a society that, to a large degree, works in that same type of area. The whole concept that we have being presented to us by our persons in political positions, and that we have people around us, and it's when it comes to voting, how are most people gauging who they're going to vote for?
Republican and Democrat.
I know that, but when you're looking at the character of the two candidates, what's a common phrase?
Trustworthy.
No.
Shady she.
That comes out when it comes to, well, who are you going to vote for? How are you going to make your choice?
Well, I think personally it's people who really are on surface level, who's going to do the best for me.
Right. But a lot of times you hear people saying, well, you just got to choose the lesser of two evils. But what's wrong with that? And I hear this a lot with the Republicans that I run around with, and I say it to them every time they use that phrase. What's the problem with that phrasing? Choosing the lesser of two evils.
Why are they put in there in the first place?
No.
They're still evil.
They're still evil. You're still choosing evil. And if we're not actually going to choose good and what's right, what are we doing?
Choosing wrong.
Choosing wrong.
So why are they there in the first place?
No, you don't get to claim that. It's a bit of a rabbit there, but it's connected with what's happening. But then, in the midst of this, and when they're trying to figure out what to do, Caiaphas chimes in. 49, one of them named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. He speaks up in the middle of this crowd, and he just says, you are not getting anywhere. All y'all are doing is just talking. Well, what are we going to do? We're planning, we're scheming, but you're not actually putting anything into action. And that's the reason why he ends up making this suggestion. He's saying to them, we have actually got to do something. And he makes the statement of, well, you are not considering that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Now, to understand what is being mentioned here, we've got to go back and spend some time in the Old Testament. Because in verse 51 and 52, we're going to be told that Caiaphas is not saying this on his own accord, but that in fact he's making a prophetic statement. And when we go back to passages like, for example, in the book of Numbers, and we have being laid out for us what the priesthood, and specifically the high priest, was going to be involved in doing for the people. Numbers 27:18. Moses is getting Joshua ready to take charge. And in getting him ready to take charge, he gives him information as to how he's going to have some help in leading the people. The Lord said unto Moses, Take thee Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay thine hand upon him. And set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and give him charge in their sight. And thou shalt put some of thine honor upon him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord. At his word shall they go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, even all the congregation. Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and he took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and he laid his hands upon him and gave him a charge, as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. So when a question arose during the Old Testament times, at this point, revelation was given to the priest, and to the high priest, to what direction they should take. And you have that further symbolized when the Israelites enter into the land of Canaan and they cross the Jordan River. Who went first? The high priest and the priest with the Ark of the Covenant. They are leading the people in. So now here is a person at this time in Israel's history that has perverted the whole system. But he still is the high priest. And that God, in this situation, brings in this information to him. This spake he, Caiaphas, not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. And not for that nation only. So this is John, by revelation, giving us insight, giving us explanation to what Caiaphas is saying. Not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. So Caiaphas has said more than he intended to say. Caiaphas thought if someone would die for the nation, then that would save the nation from Roman aggression. And specifically, it would save their own skins. That's the only people he's thinking about, is us. Well, we're in charge. If we kill this man, if we sacrifice this man, then they'll spare us. And as we mentioned, it's just like what was said in Matthew 27:25, before Christ is to be crucified, that all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children." And it's just, okay. That's a pretty interesting statement, considering what's about to happen. But even when we're considering, now we need to go back, again, we'll go back into the Old Testament here in just a moment to catch an understanding, a better understanding of what John is explaining here about what Caiaphas has said. So what Caiaphas is doing and what Caiaphas is saying, again, should have triggered things in the Jewish mind. That, okay, we've heard this somewhere before. But of course, if you're only thinking materialistic and you're thinking physically and especially thinking selfishly, the last thing you're going to be doing is making spiritual application to Old Testament prophets and what they're saying. But when we're thinking about this point also, that here is Caiaphas, and he's the head honcho when it comes to the murder of the Son of God. And yet, he is able to prophesy. Now, prophesying is a miraculous act. That's made possible by the Holy Spirit. How does this help us in dealing with some of our denominational friends and how they view a sign or proof of a person being saved?
Because the Holy Spirit is helping him out, but it doesn't take over every aspect of him. He's still evil.
Yeah.
He still chooses evil. So
Mhm.
he has free will.
Yeah.
And he's not necessarily saved just because the Holy Spirit is helping give us prophecy, which was determined by God for us to read and others like us. So.
Okay.
Would that be the Pentecostals, where you have to have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in order to be saved?
Okay.
So this right here proves that wrong, where you can have it, but you're not a good person, as Mom was just saying.
Okay. All right.
That was it.
All right.
But Calvinists would come in and say, well, you can still be saved.
Right. Yeah. And specifically, it helps with Acts 10 with Cornelius and their household. Because what's the significant point about the layout?
Got it, and then he was baptized.
He
Okay.
was saved, got the Holy Spirit, so that's proof that he was saved first. Then you get baptized as a sign.
Right.
But that's not proof because of this.
I
Right.
basically said that, but
Okay, so this is a big, huge deal for us to write down and memorize.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, granted, do we have miracles as signs of, well, no, let me take this back. What this helps us establish is that this ability does not prove a person's salvation or standing with God. Because not only do you have this situation with Caiaphas, but you also have a very obvious situation with Christians that are rich in spiritual gifts, but then are clearly not in a right standing with God. And who would that be? Corinth. The whole letter, first letter being written to them. Here are all these things that you're able to do, and that because you're children of God, you're sanctified, you're brothers and sisters together, and you're able to do these things, but that doesn't mean you're going to heaven. That in fact you have these things, able to do these things, and you are still just as lost as somebody out here who hadn't obeyed the gospel because of how you're behaving, how you're acting, your lack of character. And then, so even going to the Calvinist point, which we're going to be diving into more with our episode tonight, even when we're considering Romans 9 and the whole discussion about, well, God choosing Jacob and rejecting Esau, so on and so forth, is that in anywhere in the context discussing their salvation?
No, but would it be where they take it because it says, and he hated?
Yeah.
So that's
where that's where they take it.
Yeah, that's where the condemnation happens.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, he was hated, so he's not being saved.
Mm-hmm.
But does hated mean hated in that sense?
It has nothing to do with the state of their soul. It simply has to do with what God's plan is. Because if we're going in accordance of the natural things and how lineage continues, and, for example, who gets the birthright and the promises, who gets that?
Jacob.
No,
Oh, the firstborn?
the firstborn. So it should have been Esau. Why did God choose Jacob? Because he can. And it's not a situation that, oh, Jacob is just some better person than Esau. Jacob was a low-down scoundrel. Why choose him? It's just for God's purpose. But it doesn't mean that Jacob is just automatically saved and Esau is automatically lost. That has nothing to do with it. It just simply has to do with God's purpose and God's plan. Yes? Okay.
I'm just listening.
Okay.
I'm trying to-
Like,
All right, so a bit of excursion there, but it's okay. So now let's go back into this explanation that John has given us. He spake this not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only, but that he also should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. First, we want to look at Genesis 49. Genesis 49 is Joseph preparing himself to die. He's giving blessings and cursings to some of his sons. And when we get down to verse 9, where he lays a blessing to Judah, there's something of peculiar interest for us and for the Jewish nation that they are needing to keep in their remembrance. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. He says of Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Who holds the scepter? No, not the priest.
God.
No.
Okay.
Huh? Say it louder. The king.
Good job, Rebecca.
Nor a lawgiver from between his feet. Who is it that's going to end up giving out law? Granted, it's supposed to be the priests and everything such as that. But God has foretold, and he will foretell again in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, on how it is that they're going to end up establishing a king, even though they're not supposed to. Well, Judah is going to hold the scepter. The lawgiver would not depart from between his feet. And then you have this mention of Shiloh. What does Shiloh mean? Now, Shiloh is going to end up being a place inside of Israel, and that's where the tabernacle is going to be for a while until it gets destroyed.
That
Yes. And if memory serves me correctly, Shiloh means peace. What?
She had it.
But then, the final part. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Now, the ASV translates it a little bit differently. Does somebody have the ASV?
I have the new ASV.
Okay, it should be.
I got the NIV.
No, you better not.
You're saying Genesis?
Yeah. And this last section about gathering of the people. Now, it's not a big difference, but it is a minute detail that helps out a little bit.
By the way, it's not Joseph who's dying. You said Joseph earlier is dying.
Jacob.
Jacob.
Yeah,
The
sorry.
scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people.
Okay. The difference is where the King James says people, but the American Standard Version says peoples. You remember in John 10, where we're discussing the topic of the Good Shepherd, and he's bringing out of the flock into this sheepfold, but then he mentions, well, there's sheep that I have that are not of this flock, and they're going to be brought into this fold, that they can be one flock with one shepherd. So John tells us what Caiaphas said was prophetic and connected to Genesis 49 of what is going to happen. And that it's not just a saving of that nation only. This isn't just a saving of the Jewish nation, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. We're bringing in peoples, not just one class of people. Now, you connect that to Ezekiel 21, 26, and 27. So let's move a little bit further in Israel's history, getting closer to the time of the Messiah. And this is what Ezekiel prophesies about. Thus saith the Lord God, remove the diadem, take off the crown. This shall not be the same. Exalt him that is low, and abase him that is high. I will overturn it. And it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it to him. Israel in 1 Samuel 8 wanted an earthly king like the other nations. God never desired that for them, but he gave it to them nonetheless. Now they're being told by Ezekiel, things are going to change with your king. Remove the diadem, take off the crown. I will overturn it. And it shall be no more until, there's the change. Here's a difference that's taking place. Until he come whose right it is. Well, who's that? It's the Messiah. It's Jesus who has the right to wear the crown. Genesis tells us that it was Judah. That has its connection back to the Christ. And then you move further into the New Testament, into the epistles, and this is what Paul has to say about the whole situation, which it would be good to, if you take the time to read Ephesians 1 through 10, but we're just going to read verse 10, that in the dispensation of the fullness of times, he might gather together in one all things. He's not dying for that nation only, but he's gathering the peoples. Jew and Gentile alike are coming into this place, both which are in heaven which are on earth, even in him, the fullness of the administration, to gather all things into one, into Christ. And then he goes on to say more about it in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15 through 17. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain, Jew and Gentile, one new man, and so making peace, till Shiloh come. And that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. And came and preached peace to you which were afar off, that's the Gentiles, and to them that were nigh, that's your Jews. He's not just dying for this physical seed of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He's not just being sacrificed for this one nation only, but it's for everybody. And then you attach that over to John 17:20, very famous passage. Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word, that they all may be one. The gathering of the peoples. As thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. So all the way back into Genesis 49, God had a plan for the Gentiles. And it's not a separate plan. The Gentiles are included in everything that's going on throughout the Mosaic system. Yes, ma'am.
With that being said, when we had our Mormon study on Thursday, and Rachel brought up 1 Peter 1 and the verses where the prophets and the angels desired to look into the mystery, but they were denied. With what you have just said, where we're going back to Genesis 49, and God has always wanted everyone to be saved or come together. Did the Jews fully understand? Was it explained to them? Did they know that? Or did they just simply not know it enough? Sorry.
No. Swallowed it wrong. You going?
And just take on that prideful arrogance that they had of, we're the ones only.
I believe we've used it in other points of our study and trying to make that point. When we, in our Matthew study, we went back into Exodus and we were looking and we were reading later on, after the Ten Commandments were given, that Moses is being told to tell the people, you are going to have strangers coming in. And these strangers, you don't mistreat them. You don't treat them as though they are lesser people than you. And the reason was because you were a stranger in Egypt. You were there, and you should recognize, because we were there and how awfully we were treated, we don't need to treat them as though they're second class.
With you saying that, recently you also brought up the fact that King Solomon, with the 3 different kinds of people coming in to worship,
Yes.
we went through that, and one of which was basically the stranger, and even though they didn't have the right concept, they still wanted to be there.
Right.
And they were told, don't mistreat them there.
That's right.
So the same idea is there.
Yep. And even so, at the dedication of the temple, Solomon makes that statement and that connection. And even as you move into the prophets that are preparing Israel for their destruction and their judgment, Isaiah specifically, Jeremiah makes mention of it throughout their prophecies on how it's going to end up being that, yes, Israel is going to be taken into judgment and they're going to be carried out, but you're going to be able to come back and be established in righteousness. And Isaiah uses the terminology that they are going to end up being an ensign to the Gentiles. And an ensign is just a fancy word for a flag. You're going to be a sign, a symbol, that's going to end up drawing the Gentiles in. So absolutely, there were some very, very pointed statements being made to them throughout their history. But it goes back to that pride and arrogancy point of that if you just think that you are this special thing and you're not going to consider these pretty clear statements of no, God wants these people in. And even going back to Moses was constantly telling them, God did not choose you just because you're so special. Moses was continuously pointing out to them, you're hard-hearted, you're stiff-necked, and you're a rebellious people. So then why is it that they have the position that they have? It's because of the promise that He made to your fathers. That you have anything that you have. So all of that was designed to humble them. But it just goes to show that if you're not studying correctly or even ignoring certain points that, can you imagine as a Jew having to go back and reread those sections where Moses is talking about you that way? I could see where somebody would want to skip that or try to explain it away. But you can't. And if you do, you completely miss the point. And to a large degree, that's what had happened to the nation. And especially once they got a king, established themselves in that way, and especially under Solomon, to where he ended up expanding the borders of the promised land beyond what God had even promised, and they had wealth beyond measure.
In the Americas.
Yeah, right. And just, you look at that from that physical standpoint, it's just, okay, yeah, we must really be something special. But in the grand scheme, it's not what you think. And even for us, that's an important lesson for us to keep in mind too. I mean, here we are, and we promote ourselves as being the one true church, following the one true doctrine, and we're the ones with salvation and everybody else is missing out. Was that because we're just so special?
No.
No. It's the only reason why we have these things available to us is because of what God has promised. So then that should help us from being careful that we don't just look down on people or consider people as not being viable candidates. Because in the grand scheme of things, neither were we. But we can miss that. We can get too puffed up, as what Paul discussed in the 1 Corinthians letter, and start losing sight of what the church is supposed to be and what the church is supposed to do. We're supposed to be a light that's drawing people out of darkness. Well, okay, that's going to bring some unclean and messed up people our way. That's what we're supposed to do. So, yeah, good question, good point. Any other thoughts, comments on that vein? So, yeah, even though a lot of it is signified, there still were some very pointed or very clear and distinct points being made throughout the Old Testament towards them, and that they needed to watch themselves and not just cast out everybody else. And then a really big point, everybody that they are fighting with are their relatives. Everybody that inhabited the land of Canaan before they did came off the ark. They knew about God. But it's just what happens as man progresses and as history moves on, man corrupts and man perverts. So as they're going in and being told to utterly destroy all these people, well, they should have been thinking to themselves, but these are our cousins. These are people that come from Shem, Ham, come from Noah just like we did. But when you think about just human character, when you think about human character from that standpoint, and you move it into points of application of, you take somebody that's been bullied all their life, and then they end up being placed into a position of power, what do they end up doing? They end up bullying. And you see it a good bit with these guys that want to audit the police, and you come across that pushy and authoritative police officer, and they just end up asking, you were bullied in high school, weren't you? And more than likely that's right. And that it's just, well, okay, you were pushed around then, you couldn't do anything about it, so now I'm going to get into a position of power to where I can push people around. Turned into a revenge thing, a spite thing. You just take the nation of Israel. They'd been in slavery for 400 years. Now all of a sudden they're the ones in charge. How easy it would be to just say, okay, we got pushed around before, now it's our turn to do the pushing. All those kind of things come into play. All right, anything else? Okay. So then verse 53. Now we shift from the high priest and that secret council back over to Jesus and his disciples. Then from that day forth, they took counsel together for to put him to death. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. All right, so they determined there's only one thing left to do. We've got to kill him. We cannot answer him. We cannot go toe-to-toe with him when it comes to doctrine and understanding the scriptures. You can't destroy the message. You destroy the messenger. And we need to make a note that here is the point where Jesus breaks from the nation as a whole. From this point in 11 through John 17 and leading into 18 to where he's going to be captured and taken to court, there's no more contact with the Jewish nation. What contact he will have is only going to be at his trial. His signs, his work, and teaching being done in front of them is done. And their unbelief has hardened so greatly that there's nothing left for them until it comes time for his crucifixion. So he departs from Bethany, goes to Ephraim. Now this is a estimation and possible guess as to where people think that Ephraim is, and you can tell by this, hopefully, that this is a mountainous area. Goes to a desert place, quiet place, solitude, wilderness. Ephraim is here. Bethel, just giving you some landmarks to kind of consider where we are. Jericho, the Jordan River flowing through here, through that valley. But he departs there, begins his time alone, and then verse 55, he ends up having to come back to Jerusalem. The Jews' Passover was nigh at hand. Many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover, and they're doing this for the specific reason to purify themselves. And this becomes a key verse to help us to understand the feet washing topic that's going to end up coming up in John 13. It's not just a washing of feet to be hospitable. These people are leaving early. It's at hand. It's not actually happening. They're leaving ahead of time so that they can specifically come for the purpose to purify themselves. Under the Old Testament law, if you touched a dead body, or you handled certain things, or you're involved in certain practices, you would become unclean. And that depending on what it is that you're dealing with, there'd be a certain amount of days that you'd have to separate yourself, you'd have to wash, before you'd be able to come back before God and be able to worship. And so they are taking advantage of this time to make sure that they're ready to come before God. And if you go back into Israel's history in 2 Chronicles, you actually read about a group of people that the king has to pray for them or pray on behalf of them, because they hadn't kept the Passover for a long time, and since they hadn't kept it, they had forgotten some of the rules, and some of the people actually came to partake of the Passover without washing. And that was a huge point in their history that was recorded for them. Well, here we have people, and they're saying, okay, we're not going to go through that again. So they are being very careful to make sure that they can come before God purified. So this really is a Jewish washing. And that to be ceremonially, physically clean to be able to worship God. Purification to come before Him. And it's important for us to have this because of what's recorded next. Here you have people traveling from all over for the purpose to make sure that they are cleansed to worship God. And then there's this. Then sought they for Jesus, and spake among themselves as they stood in the temple, What think ye, that He will not come to the feast? Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he were, he should show it, and that they might take him. All right, here's the plan. Plan's made, laid out, the bait's been set. Here we are at the Feast of Feasts. This is the highlight of their year. It's the start of their year. And it's a remembrance of God's deliverance of the people from Egyptian bondage. And it was at this time, it's at that point, as recorded in Exodus, that they became a nation. That's the first time you have the word nation being used in connection with Israel. God has delivered them from their oppressors. And it's at this point where they're going to take Him. A time when they should be thinking about purification, righteousness, holiness, sanctification. And then they have murder on their minds. And here we have, once again, as Jesus stated in Matthew chapter 6, light of the body is the eye. And that's through the eye in which light is able to enter in. But then Jesus makes a statement about, well, if darkness is able to overcome that light, just how great, how powerful does that darkness have to be to overpower the light? Here's an illustration. How powerful is sin when it's allowed to take root and it's not dealt with? It is so powerful and so wicked that even at the most holy and reverential day of your year, you're corrupted by it. You're consumed by it. And that with everything that's going on should be pricking you in your conscience to say, I shouldn't even be thinking about this. This shouldn't even be a consideration in my mind at this point. But there it is. How great is that darkness? And that application is still in play for us today. What Jesus is teaching there in Matthew chapter 6 are principles, are things that are going to be applicable inside of his kingdom. And that again showing that these things that God has laid out for us to be involved in. Our time of study here today, the worship assembly that we're about to partake in together. The spiritual characteristics of life that we're supposed to take on as being his children and being his servants. Will not do anything for us. If we're holding on to something carnal, fleshly, sinful. If we're not addressing those things, if we're not dealing with those things, we push them all to the side and say, no, can't touch this. Then we'll just be going through the motions. We'll just be going through the ceremony, going through the ritual. But all these things that God has given to us are designed to touch us. And we've made big points about that in discussion and looking at the life of Christ, especially in Matthew's gospel account, and just the number of times that Jesus came through and touched people. These things are designed to change us. And if we're not going through change, growth, then these things really are not having a proper effect on us. And that, you just look at everything that went on with the Corinthian church. All the things that Jesus discussed. You're wanting to be a child of God, and you want to teach and promote about thou shalt not kill, but here you are hating your brother. You can't have both. Teaching and promoting. Well, don't commit adultery. But then here you are lusting. Can't have both. And it all goes back to Romans 6 and Paul's discussion about yielding yourself over to the sin. Well, I'll just give myself over to it, and then Romans 6:1, God's grace will cover it. Nope. But Israel, at this time, has missed that point. Everything has become so wrapped up in the physical, material of their religion. And they're overlooking the spiritual. And that's just how powerful sin is. And they, throughout all this time, making excuses, twisting scriptures, flat out lying to the people. They're doing all of those things that their forefathers did. And they're right there in the same position that Isaiah chapter 1 writes about, where God says to the people, I am sick of your sacrifices. And it's because of all the wickedness that you're doing. Oh, but that doesn't apply to us. No. That's talking about them. That's not talking about us. It was talking about them, and it's talking to us today. Now, with this concluding chapter 11, it doesn't disconnect from the chapter that's coming. There is a shift that's going to take place as we get into chapter 12, but it's going to work as a bridge for us. Particularly, chapter 12 is a bridge from 1152 over into chapter 13. And to tie those things together. And the reason for that, because chapter 13 through 17 is private conversation with the disciples. But chapter 12 gives us some important events that we not only have a breakaway from the nation, but we're also going to be shown about a break that's going to happen amongst his followers. There's going to be a break from amongst the apostles. And chapter 12 is going to give for us the type of subject matter that we studied back in chapter 10, where Jesus is describing, or excuse me, he gives us a study of contrasts. Remember John 10, he's discussing how that he is the true shepherd, he's the good shepherd. And that was a contrast between his leadership and the leadership that they had at that time. Well, John 12 is going to give us a same type of study. There's a contrast in character from the character of Mary and the character of Judas. And giving us a picture and a study of what true discipleship looks like. So we'll talk about that more next week as we dive into 12. Yep.
I have a question. With your talk with regard to bridging and separation and Jesus separated, in verse 55, do we take from this language when it says, and the Passover of the Jews, is that anything specific
Like, is it just simply stating that, or is it kind of a point of they're separated now, that Jewish system, and we're going a different way?
I would lean towards that. I know there's a lot of commentators, and even what's the other book that you?
David Sproul?
What I thought you had.
Guy
Guy Woods.
I didn't read that.
Oh, okay.
I just noticed this.
Well, I think even in Guy Woods, in his information, there's connection to those type of statements being made, and that John's record of the gospel accounts is not just for Jewish audiences, but it's also for Gentiles, and that it's establishing for them. Okay, this is the Jews' Passover, so on and so forth, and laying that out for them. Okay, I can see that. But then also knowing about, like you're stating, about how there's so much discussion about how that we are leaving this behind, we're moving away from this, and especially with what Israel has done to God's system at this time, that yes, I would be in agreement with you that this is just a Jewish thing now. And especially during the time frame where John would be writing this, because he's not giving a real-time documentation. He's writing after these things have happened, and he's actually writing in the time frame where, the law of Moses and that Mosaical system's been set to the side, and now we're under the law of Christ. So that, this is all a writing backwards, and we're using terminology to describe what had happened. The temple is no longer God's house. This is your house. And it's going to be left desolate. This is no longer God's system. This is your system. And you are manipulating it and treating it and operating it how you want. And then, especially tying that over to that's there. Now we have what Christ has established. So, I would be in agreement with that. Okay, anything else? All right.
Yeah, I have 11.
Then we'll stop, take our break, and then we will pick up next week in 12, coming back